There are so many hair loss treatments on the market right now that most people genuinely don't know what actually works in 2026, what's overhyped, what causes side effects, and what realistically is worth spending money on long term. Every week there's a new breakthrough treatment claiming it can regrow hair faster. So in this video, I'm going through 12 of the biggest hair loss treatments and ranking them from S tier to C tier. Yes, a lot of popular creators have already made videos on hair loss treatments. But what separates this video from most other videos is that we're only ranking treatments that still work in this day and age. Of course, hair loss results are never identical for everyone. Their effectiveness can vary depending on multiple factors. But despite that, these treatments continue to deliver real results in 2026. Hi, I'm Bobby Spence. I'm a certified trichologist, and since our inception, we've helped thousands of people here at Theradome to stop hair loss, improve their hair growth and hair density, and not by blindly chasing every viral treatment that jumps from one supplement to another, but by following a very specific approach that most people completely overlook. I'll talk more about that later in this video. Now, before I rank these 12 hair loss treatments for you, you need to understand how I'm evaluating each treatment on this list, because the simple "does it regrow hair" criteria alone is not enough anymore. I'm looking at 4 things: effectiveness, meaning whether the treatment actually improves hair density, crown thinning, follicular miniaturization, or overall regrowth in peer-reviewed clinical studies; cost and accessibility, meaning whether a normal person can realistically afford and maintain it long term; beginner versus advanced fit, meaning whether it's something you should start with early or something more advanced users experiment with later, because starting in the wrong order is one of the biggest mistakes people make in hair restoration; and finally, sustainability and convenience, because hair loss is chronic. Hair restoration is long-term, and if you realistically cannot stay consistent with the treatment for 2, 3, or even 5 years, then even the most effective treatment on paper usually doesn't help much in the real world. Now, once you understand these 4 things, effectiveness, accessibility, beginner fit, and long-term sustainability, you start looking at hair loss treatments like long-term strategies instead of random products, and one thing becomes very obvious: the best treatment is not always the strongest treatment. Sometimes it's the treatment that fits realistically into your routine, and it works well with other therapies and gives you the highest chance of staying consistent long enough to actually see results. And one of the best examples of balance between effectiveness, accessibility, and stacking potential is microneedling. Microneedling, also known as dermal rolling. At first glance, microneedling sounds like one of those internet biohacker hair loss trends that shouldn't logically work. You're literally puncturing your scalp with tiny needles in hopes to improve your hair regrowth. But once you actually look into the clinical studies on androgenetic alopecia and follicular stimulation, the results become very difficult to ignore. Now, in terms of effectiveness, microneedling has shown surprisingly meaningful results, both alone and especially when combined with topical minoxidil. The theory is that controlled micro-injuries stimulate wound healing pathways, collagen production, growth factor release, and potentially improve absorption of topical hair loss treatments. And clinically, combination protocols involving microneedling, minoxidil, DHT blockers often outperform standalone treatment approaches. Now, where microneedling becomes attractive is the cost. At-home dermal rollers are relatively inexpensive, and even professional dermapen sessions are cheaper than things like PRP or hair transplants. And from a beginner versus advanced perspective, microneedling sits somewhere in the middle. This is not something I would tell a complete beginner with early hair thinning to obsess over immediately, or once you understand, needle depth, frequency, hygiene, and scalp recovery, it can become a very powerful addition to a hair growth protocol. Where microneedling becomes difficult is sustainability, because unlike swallowing a pill or wearing a laser helmet, microneedling requires effort, consistency, discomfort techniques, and proper sanitation, And poor execution can absolutely damage the scalp barrier or worsen inflammation if done incorrectly. Because of its strong combination potential and surprisingly good clinical data, microneedling lands in the tier for me. Now, microneedling stimulates repair pathways through controlled injury. The next treatment, it tries to do something similar, except instead of creating microneedling injuries, it injects concentrated growth factors directly into the scalp. And on paper, that sounds incredibly promising. In reality, the story is more complicated, which brings me to one of the most marketed treatments in the entire modern hair restoration industry, PRP, which is better known as platelet-rich plasma. Celebrities talk about it, clinicals charge thousands of dollars for it, and if you search hair regrowth treatments online, PRP will show up consistently and constantly. But when you separate the marketing from the actual evidence, the picture becomes much less straightforward. Now, in terms of effectiveness, PRP absolutely has some promising clinical data. The idea itself makes sense. Take concentrated platelets from your own blood, isolate growth factors, and inject them into areas affected by follicular miniaturization and hair thinning. Some studies show meaningful improvements in hair density, shaft thickness, and diffuse thinning. But the problem is consistency. Different clinics use different preparation methods, different injection depths, different platelet concentrations, and different treatment schedules, which mean outcomes vary massively from person to person. Now, where PRP becomes difficult very quickly is the cost. Because unlike finasteride or topical minoxidil, this is not a low-cost, long-term hair loss treatment. Most people require multiple sessions up front, maintenance sessions later, and reoccurring clinical visits. And over time, the cost becomes substantial. But when it comes to beginner versus advanced fit, PRP is definitely not where I would tell most beginners to start. This is usually something explored after foundational DHT blockers, minoxidil, scalp treatments, and consistent hair restoration routines are already in place. But PRP struggles most with its sustainability because maintaining injections, appointments, recurring costs, and variable outcome becomes difficult long term because someone is seeing clear, visible results. And for many people, the inconsistency becomes frustrating. Because of that combination of promising science but inconsistent real-world outcome, PRP lands in the D tier for me. Now, PRP requires clinical needles, appointments, and recurring costs. The next treatment is far more accessible and easier to incorporate into a regular routine. And it originated as a pharmaceutical antifungal treatment, ketoconazole. Ketoconazole shampoo gets dismissed constantly because it's cheap, it's a shampoo, and it doesn't sound exciting, which is exactly why most people underestimate it. Now, to be clear, ketoconazole shampoo is not going to grow an entire hairline by itself. That's not what it's for. But when it comes to effectiveness, ketoconazole plays an important role in supporting many evidence-based hair restoration protocols, especially for people dealing with dandruff, seborrheic dermatitis, scalp inflammation, itching, excessive oil, or inflamed scalp environments that can worsen hair shedding over time. And because inflammation and scalp health matters more, most people realize that androgenetic alopecia, improving the scalp environment, can indirectly support healthier follicular function. Now, where ketoconazole becomes extremely attractive is the cost and simplicity. A product like Nazarol is widely available, inexpensive, beginner-friendly, and easy to integrate almost into every hair loss routine. You're literally replacing your shampoo a few times a week. That's it. And from a beginner versus advanced standpoint, ketoconazole works well for both. Now, where it becomes especially strong is sustainability because unlike complicated multi-step hair growth protocols, this requires almost no additional effort, which is exactly what adherence tends to stay high in terms of long-term sustainability. As long as people don't overuse it and dry out their scalp, it's one of the easiest supportive treatments to maintain consistently. Because of its low cost, strong support role, and long-term practicality, ketoconazole shampoo lands in the C tier. Now, ketoconazole works mainly on the scalp environment. However, the next treatment goes much deeper, replacing hair that's already gone. And that's where hair transplants enters the conversation. Hair transplants, at some point, most everyone dealing with significant hair loss thinks about getting a hair transplant because on the surface, it feels like the closest thing to a permanent solution. But what most people don't fully understand is that hair transplantation is not really a cure for androgenetic alopecia, it's just redistribution. And that distinction matters enormously. When it comes to effectiveness, modern hair transplants absolutely work, especially procedures like FUE, FUT, and dense packing techniques performed by experienced surgeons. The transplanted follicles are typically taken from DHT-resistant donor areas and moved into regions affected by receding hairlines, crown thinning, and follicular miniaturization. And visually, the results can be transformative. But where hair transplants become more complicated is long-term planning, because native hair surrounding the transplanted grafts can still continue to thin if the underlying androgenetic alopecia isn't controlled, which is why most reputable transplant surgeons still recommend broader hair maintenance protocols afterwards. Now, where hair transplants become difficult for many people is the cost. This is easily one of the most expensive treatments in the entire hair restoration space, and quality difference between elite surgeons, average clinics, and low-cost hair mills can completely change outcomes. When it comes to beginner versus advanced fit, this is absolutely an advanced stage decision. Getting a transplant too early can exhaust donor supply, create unnatural density patterns, or lock someone into years of correction procedures later. And sustainability is also more complex than people assume, because while the surgery itself is technically one time, maintaining surrounding native hair is usually lifelong. So for many people, the transplant becomes the beginning of a maintenance protocol, not the end of one. Because of its transformative cosmetic potential, but high cost and long-term planning requirements, hair transplantation lands at the B tier for me. But most people, surgery is not where the hair loss journey realistically starts. It usually starts with the treatment that becomes the benchmark for male pattern baldness itself. Finasteride, I want to address something important, because finasteride has become one of the most emotionally polarizing treatments in the entire hair loss industry. Depending on where you learned about it, online, or either think it's the gold standard for male pattern hair loss, or you think it's dangerous enough to never touch it, the reality is more nuanced than either extreme. Now, when it comes to effectiveness, finasteride is still the benchmark DHT blocker in androgenetic alopecia treatment. Clinically, it works by inhibiting type 5-alpha reductase scalp DHT. It slowly miniaturizes the follicle and helps preserve hair density over time. Multiple studies consistently show meaningful stabilization and measure hair regrowth in men and crown thinning and receding hairlines. Now, where finasteride becomes even more impressive is the cost. Generic finasteride is relatively affordable in most countries and remains one of the most accessible, clinically validated hair loss treatments available. And when it comes to beginner versus advanced fit, finasteride is still the foundation most evidence-based hair loss protocols are built around. But where finasteride becomes more complicated is sustainability, because where many users tolerate it extremely well, a meaningful percentage of people are concerned about its side effects like libido changes, erectile dysfunction, brain fog, and psychological side effects. And whether those risks are common or uncommon, the fear around them is real and absolutely affects long-term adherence. Because of that balance between clinical effectiveness, accessibility, and long-term data, finasteride lands at the D tier for me. Finasteride is the benchmark, but after a point, many people start looking for treatments that don't involve hormonal interference at all. That's where LLLT changes the conversation completely. LLLT, low-level laser therapy, is probably the most misunderstood treatment in the entire hair loss industry. Some people think laser helmets are completely scams. Others think they're miracle devices that regrow a full hairline in 6 months. The truth sits somewhere in the middle, but what surprises most people is that the clinical evidence behind FDA-cleared low-level laser therapy for hair loss is actually more stronger than they expect. Now, when it comes to effectiveness, low-level laser therapy works very differently from treatments like finasteride, dutasteride, and topical minoxidil. It is not primarily a DHT blocker, and it's not simply forcing follicles into the growth phase either. Instead, low-level laser therapy, also called photobiomodulation, uses specific wavelengths of red light therapy to stimulate mitochondrial activity inside follicle cells. The idea is that improving cellular energy production, circulation, scalp environment, and follicular metabolism, you create conditions that support healthier and long-lasting hair growth cycles. And unlike many people assume, modern FDA-cleared laser therapy devices actually do have peer-reviewed clinical data showing statistically significant improvements in hair density, terminal hair count, and follicular thickness. Now, where low-level laser therapy becomes extremely attractive is the cost over time. Yes, the upfront cost of a laser helmet like Theradome is higher than buying a bottle of minoxidil, but unlike PRP, hair transplants, or reoccurring clinic treatments, this is still a one-time purchase with no monthly prescriptions, reoccurring appointments, injections, or consumables. And over a 2 to 3 year period, the cost per use becomes surprisingly reasonable compared to many long-term hair restoration treatments. Now, from a beginner versus advanced perspective, this is one of the few treatments that genuinely work for both groups. Beginners like it because there's no learning curve. There's no hormonal interference, no shedding, nothing to panic about, no complex hair loss protocol. Advanced users like it because it stacks extremely well with broader hair regrowth routines. But where low-level laser therapy really separates itself from many treatments on this list is sustainability, because sustainability is where most hair loss routines fail. With laser therapy, especially helmet-based systems like Theradome, the barrier to consistency becomes extremely low. You wear it at home while working or watching Netflix, and because there are no systemic side effects, no hormonal disruption, and no daily topical mess, adherence becomes dramatically easier for many people, which matters far more than people realize in long-term hair restoration, because treatment, you can realistically stay on it for 5 years and is often more valuable than any aggressive treatment you quit after 4 months. And because of that combination of clinical evidence, long-term sustainability, convenience, stacking potential, and side effect profile, low-level laser therapy comfortably lands in the S tier for me. Now, here's the interesting part. Everything above low-level laser therapy on this list so far either interferes hormonally, requires needles, causes shedding, anxiety, or creates some form of long-term friction. Low-level laser therapy sits at a very unique position. It's FDA-cleared, clinically studied, side effect-free, passive, and genuinely sustainable long-term. And personally, after years of seeing people cycle through hair loss treatments they couldn't realistically maintain, this becomes one of the few categories I consistently saw people actually stick with, especially when the device quality was good. Because not all laser helmets were equally treated or created. Wavelength, power, density, and coverage matter. Cheap, low-powered LED devices often do very little, which is why devices engineered specifically around clinical photobiomodulation parameters matter significantly more than consumers realize. And that's one of the reasons Theradome became so respected in the laser hair growth space. It was developed by a former NASA scientist, and over the years, I've seen real long-term before and after results from users dealing with diffuse thinning, crown thinning, androgenetic alopecia, and early follicular miniaturization. So if you've been looking for a clinically backed, low-friction, side effect-free hair restoration treatment that you can realistically stay consistent with long-term, you can check out Theradome through the link below. Now, while LLT works extremely well as a long-term maintenance and support treatment, a lot of people eventually start wondering about the next generation of hair loss treatments, the experimental therapies that claim they might go beyond traditional DHT blockers and follicular stimulation altogether. And that's exactly where peptides, PP405, and emerging hair loss drugs enter the conversation. Peptides, PP405. This is the section of the hair loss industry where things start moving incredibly fast. Every few months, there's a new peptide, a new growth factor, a new breakthrough molecule, or a new experimental treatment claiming it might replace finasteride or minoxidil completely. And right now, PP405 is probably one of the biggest names in that conversation. Now, when it comes to effectiveness, this category is difficult to rank because the science is still developing in real time. The reason treatments like PP405 generate so much excitement is because they're trying to target dormant follicle biology in entirely new ways. The promise is activating inactive follicles, improving follicular regeneration, and potentially restoring hair growth without relying entirely on traditional hormonal pathways. And conceptually, that's extremely compelling, but conceptually compelling and clinical proven are not the same. Despite all the excitement online, most of these treatments still lack large-scale human data, long-term safety tracking, and real-world maintenance outcomes. So right now, much of the excitement around peptides and emerging regenerative treatments is still based more on possibility than established evidence. Now, where this category becomes especially difficult is accessibility. Most people cannot realistically access regulated versions, proper clinical trials, or medically supervised protocols, which is why so much of the space has turned into gray market compounds, experimental sourcing, and self-experimentation. And that creates enormous variability in safety, dosing, and expectations. Now, from a beginner versus advanced perspective, this is definitely advanced territory. And honestly, many people entering this category are often skipping foundational treatments they should have optimized first, because experimental treatments become emotionally attractive when you feel frustrated or exhausted by existing options. But chasing the future cure while ignoring proven treatments is usually a mistake. And sustainability here is almost impossible to properly judge right now because many of these treatments don't have established long-term protocols, standardized maintenance schedules, or enough real-world tracking. So while I do think this category is genuinely important to watch over the next 5 to 10 years, it's still too early for me to rank it alongside critically established treatments, which is why peptides and emerging hair loss drugs land in the D tier for me right now. Now, while peptides represent the future of experimental hair restoration, the next treatment represents the most controversial future treatment and that we're currently exploding across the internet, and that's called plasma RNA. Plasma RNA is probably one of the best examples of how fast the hair loss industry moves whenever a treatment sounds scientifically futuristic, because the idea behind it genuinely is exciting. Instead of lowering DHT, stimulating follicles, or improving scalp circulation, plasma RNA attempts to interfere with androgen receptors signaling genetic level using RNA interference technology, which is why the internet exploded when people first started hearing about it. The concept sounds like next generational hair loss science, and to be fair, the underlying biology is genuinely interesting. Now, when it comes to effectiveness, this is where things become much more uncertain. Early sponsored data shows modest improvements in hair density and follicular stabilization, but the problem is that the data pool is still limited. Large-scale independent replication is missing, and many experts still question whether the active molecule penetrates deeply enough into the follicle structures to consistently produce meaningful long-term results. So while the mechanism is exciting, the clinical certainty simply is not there yet. Now, the plasma RNA becomes even more difficult in accessibility. For most countries, it is hard to access. It's expensive, poorly standardized, and still operates in a relatively unclear commercial space. And from a beginner versus advanced perspective, this is absolutely not where I would tell someone with early hair thinning to begin. This is the kind of treatment people obsess over after spending years deep inside hair loss forums and biohacking communities. But for the average person trying to stabilize androgenetic alopecia, there are simply too many proven options that should come first. And sustainability becomes another major question mark because we still don't have long-term data, large user populations, or clear maintenance expectations, which means right now, plasma RNA sits more in the interesting future category than clinically established hair growth protocol category. And because of that gap between exciting science and real-world proof, plasma RNA lands in the D tier for me. Now, plasma RNA represents gene-level intervention. The next treatment takes a much more direct approach by trying to block DHT activity directly at the follicle itself. And that's why so many people are paying attention to peralumitide. Peralumitide, here's the question that's driving so much excitement around peralumitide right now. What if you could block DHT activity directly at the follicle without significantly affecting hormones throughout the rest of your body? That's essentially the promise behind topical anti-androgens like peralumitide, and that's why so many people frustrated with finasteride side effects, detesterized anxiety, or systemic DHT suppression have become extremely interested in it. Now, when it comes to effectiveness, peralumitide is designed to work differently from traditional DHT blockers. Instead of lowering DHT levels systemically, it works locally at the androgen receptor level in the scalp, which means the goal is less follicular miniaturization, less DHT signaling, while potentially avoiding broader hormonal effects. And early clinical data has genuinely been promising. Now, where peralumitide becomes difficult is accessibility, because despite all the hype surrounding it online, this is still not widely available in most markets. For most people, it currently sits in the watch closely category rather than the start immediately category. And from the beginner versus advanced perspective, this is definitely advanced territory. Sustainability in this case is also still a huge unknown, because while early tolerability data looks encouraging, we simply do not yet have long-term real-world adherence, multi-year safety, or maintenance data at the level we do for more established hair loss treatments, which means right now, peralumitide is more exciting than established. And because of that combination of strong potential but limited real-world track record, peralumitide sits at a B tier for me. Now, peralumitide tries to avoid systemic hormonal suppression entirely. The next treatment, however, becomes famous because how aggressively it stimulates hair growth itself. And that's why minoxidil changed the hair loss industry completely. Minoxidil. Here's the thing most people don't properly understand about minoxidil before starting it. During the first weeks, your hair will often shed more, and naturally that makes people panic. But if you stop during the shedding phase, you usually never reach the stage where topical minoxidil actually starts improving hair density and follicular growth. Now, when it comes to effectiveness, minoxidil is still one of the strongest clinically proven non-hormonal hair growth treatment in the entire hair restoration industry. Unlike finasteride or dutasteride, minoxidil doesn't primarily work as a DHT blocker. Instead, it acts more like a follicular growth stimulant, helping miniaturized follicles stay in the anagen growth phase longer and improving hair shaft thickness over time, which is why it's still considered one of the foundational treatments for crown thinning, diffuse thinning, and hairline maintenance. Now, where minoxidil becomes extremely attractive is accessibility. Topical minoxidil is over-the-counter, relatively cheap, globally available, and beginner friendly. Now, when it comes to beginner versus advanced fit, this is one of the few treatments that genuinely work well for both beginners as well as advanced because of the accessibility. While advanced users stack it with other hair treatments, it works well for both. But where minoxidil starts becoming difficult is sustainability, because consistency with topical minoxidil is harder than people expect. The greasy texture, the daily application, scalp irritation, and constant routine management eventually wears a lot of people down. And that's before we even talk about psychological stress of shedding phases and dependency anxiety, which is why many advanced hair loss users eventually switch towards oral minoxidil combination protocols or lower friction hair restoration system. Because of its clinical evidence, accessibility, and strong regrowth profile, minoxidil sits in the C tier for me. Now, minoxidil stimulates growth chemically, but the next category is much more experimental as far as less regulated. And this is where the hair loss industry starts becoming genuinely dangerous. Exosomes and stem cell therapy. If there's one category in the hair loss industry where the gap between marketing and science becomes extremely dangerous, it's this one. Because exosomes and stem cell clinics often market these treatments like the future of hair regeneration. And scientifically, there is some legitimate excitement here. Exosomes carry signaling molecules, growth factors, and regenerative communication proteins that may theoretically support follicle repair and scalp regeneration, which is why regenerative medicine has become such a massive topic in hair restoration. Now, when it comes to effectiveness, the problem is not that the science is fake. The problem is that the clinical evidence is still inconsistent, limited, poor, standardized, and heavily commercialized. Different clinics use different extraction methods, formulations, and concentrations and marketing claims, which means consumers often have no idea of what they're actually paying for. Now, where this category becomes especially problematic is cost, because these are some of the most expensive treatments in modern hair restoration industry. And unlike hair transplants, where at least the procedure itself is clearly defined, exosome therapies often exist inside very blurry commercial and regulatory environments. Now, from the beginner versus the advanced perspective, This is absolutely not beginner territory. This is usually where high-income biohackers, desperate long-term sufferers with chronic hair loss, or people chasing the next breakthrough end up. And unfortunately, desperation is often where hair loss industry becomes most exploitive. Now, sustainability is another major issue because we still don't have standardized protocols, long-term maintenance expectations, or enough long-term safety data, which means people are often paying thousands for treatments where even the clinics themselves may not fully know what multi-year outcomes look like yet. And because of that enormous gap between scientific potential and real-world evidence, exosomes and stem cell therapies land a D tier for me. Now, after everything we've covered so far, there's really only one treatment left to talk about: the strongest mainstream pharmaceutical DHT blocker currently available, dutasteride. Dutasteride. If finasteride blocks one pathway of DHT production, dutasteride asks a very obvious question: what happens if we block even more? And the answer is stronger DHT suppression, stronger hair stabilization, and potentially stronger hair regrowth results. When it comes to effectiveness, dutasteride is probably the most powerful mainstream pharmaceutical treatment for androgenetic alopecia currently available. Finasteride, which blocks only type 5 alpha reductase, dutasteride blocks both 1 and 2 type enzymes, leading to dramatically lower scalp DHT levels. And clinically, the hair growth data reflects the difference. Now, in terms of accessibility, dutasteride is relatively affordable like finasteride, but because it's still off-label for hair loss in many countries, access often depends on your doctor. And where dutasteride clearly becomes an advanced hair loss treatment is risk tolerance. This is usually not where people start. This is where people escalate after plateauing on finasteride, aggressive diffuse thinning, or continued crown miniaturization. Where dutasteride becomes difficult for many people is long-term psychological comfort, because broader DHT suppression naturally increases anxiety around side effects and hormonal interference, especially in people already nervous about anti-androgen. This makes me put dutasteride in the D tier. Here's what we can realistically conclude about hair loss treatment. The first thing is that there is no perfect treatment. Every single option on this list comes with some type of trade-off. The strongest DHT blocker like finasteride and dutasteride come with the biggest side effects discussed. The strongest regrowth stimulants like minoxidil often come with the shedding phase, consistency issues, and long-term maintenance problems. And the futuristic experimental treatments are exciting, but still far less proven than the internet sometimes make them sound. But the second thing this ranking makes very clear is that sustainability matters far more than most people realize, because the treatments people actually stay consistent with usually outperform the treatments they quit after 3 months. And that's one of the reasons low-level laser therapy has become so important in modern hair restoration conversations. It's clinically backed, it's non-invasive, it's easy to maintain, it stacks well with other treatments, and avoids many of the friction points that make people quit long-term protocols. But the problem is that most people still don't properly understand how laser therapy works, what wavelength matters, why cheap laser helmets often fail, how to stack LLLT correctly, and what realistic expectations actually look like, which is why we made an entire video breaking it all down properly called 10 Things No One Tells You About Laser Helmets, but you should know before you buy one. So if you've ever looked at laser therapy and thought, I still don't fully understand, is this actually legit or not? That's the video you should watch next, because it explains the science, the misconceptions, and the real-world expectations behind LLLT far more deeply than we could cover in this ranking alone.